So as we sort of enter into this, I'm gonna tell you a story, and it's a sad story, and because it's okay. So several years ago, when I was living in Texas, a friend of mine called me, and it was somebody I had known like through high school and into my first couple of years of college, and I was really good friends, not just with him, but I spent a lot of time with his family, knew his parents. I would go over to their house every once in a while for dinner or just to hang out and spend time. And I was, this is a family that for a season of my life, I was pretty close to. And my friend called me, who I hadn't even really talked to in a while, just because of life circumstances. And he called me and he said, hey, listen, I don't know if you heard, but my mom's been pretty sick. And I had heard, but I did not know how sick she was. She was dying of cancer, and she was in her mid-50s, which is young, and she had been diagnosed with a very fast, aggressive form of cancer. And he was calling to tell me hey, we're bringing her home. We're going to put her in hospice care. And the doctor is saying she may make it a week. It is really fast and really aggressive, and she is declining very rapidly. And listen, I realize, I'm just going to pause the story. When I am in a public speaking situation, I am most comfortable when people are laughing, especially early on. It tells me that people are with me and that we're all kind of having an experience together. And I realized by opening a sermon, by telling you a story about a woman who's dying of cancer, I'm kind of working against myself here. And so sorry to just enter into it with that sort of heaviness. And I realized this is a rough place to start, but bear with me. So he calls me and he tells me hey, if you want to come and visit, you do not have a lot of time. And so I the next day I went over to their house, and she was they had her set up on a kind of a bed area in the middle of the living room so that people could come and go and talk to her and visit. And so I sat in their living room for a couple of hours, and it was my friend and his dad and sister and some extended family members, and there was a lot of heaviness. Obviously, there's a lot of heaviness in the room. There's everybody knows what's happening here, but at some point, my friend's sister starts telling the story. She says, "Hey, do you guys remember?" Just out of nowhere, she says, "Hey, do you guys remember that when I was little, when I was maybe 9 or 10, our grandmother came to stay with us. It was the first time she'd stayed with us. And we were all really excited. She'd come from a long way away, and we were excited to have her in the house. And that first night that she was with us was the night that everybody learned that grandma sleepwalks naked. And so she's telling this story, and as from the perspective of an 8-year-old child who hears a bump in the night and gets up to see what it is, and it's a thing that you will never forget. And she's telling the story, and everyone is laughing. She's got people laughing so hard they are in tears, and everyone is experiencing this story it's the funniest story we've ever heard. But also, there was this realization of we're all laughing. Even the mother, the woman who was dying, is laughing. And so we're having this moment of we're here because this is an incredibly sad thing that we're all here to acknowledge and experience. But also, we're laughing. There is lightness in the midst of the heaviness. What in the world is going on when you go into a space that is filled with sorrow and grief and kind of a sense of loss, and yet there is also lightness in the room? You ever experienced something like that? Then get this, a couple of years later, I get another call from my friend's dad, the same guy, and he says, "Hey, Rob, listen, I've met somebody in the past couple of months. We've only been seeing each other for 4 or 5 months, but we're not getting any younger, and both of us have come out of previous marriages. Hers was divorce, mine was death, and we decided we want to get married. We want to spend whatever time we have left. We want to spend it together. We don't want a big ceremony. We don't want it to take a long time to plan. We just want to have it in our living room. And so would you be willing to come and perform the wedding in our living room if we had it there?" And I said, "Absolutely. I'd be thrilled to do that." So I go and we set up in their living room, and it is very small. It's this guy and the woman he's marrying and both of their grown kids and me, and that's the whole wedding. And they wanted very traditional vows. And so when we get to the part in the vows where he says, "In sickness and in health," there's this weight that's in the room because it's the same living room as a couple of years before. Are you with me? So we're in the same living room where we sat with a woman who was dying with his wife who was dying 2 years ago. And now he's standing in this room ready to spend the rest of his life with this person. And he says, in sickness and in health. And everybody in the room, there's this silent awareness of, oh, he means it. Are you with me? So in this living room, over the course of a couple of years, there was a moment of grief and loss and pain, but also with a little bit of lightness sprinkled in. And then a couple of years later, there was a moment of joy and celebration and new beginnings, but this time it's sprinkled with a little bit of heaviness. So there is this sense, all in the same room. So there is this sense of there is grief and there is grief and sorrow, and there is joy and hope, and they all exist in the same place at the same time. So what we're doing with this series, we're starting this new series, What a Terrible World, What a Beautiful World. And my teaching partner, Ashley Engel, and I, who's the other teaching pastor here, we spent a lot of time kind of going back and forth, trying to figure, like, how do we start 2025? Because you can go in a lot of different directions. Like, starting a new year with a new sermon series, it's kind of wide open. Like, you can pretty much start the year by talking about anything you want to, and you wouldn't really surprise anybody. And so the question became, okay, well, what's the most relevant, appropriate, timely thing that we could talk about? What is the overall emotional frequency of this community? What questions are people asking? What types of conversations are people even interested in having? And over the last couple of months, and I don't want to speak for her, but for me, there has, in conversations I've had with other people who are part of this community, and even who don't necessarily attend this church, but are part of the Edmond community overall, there's this kind of blended sense of, yeah, they're like going into this new year. There's a sense of maybe some anxiety, some like the state of things like the global state of things is maybe giving us a little bit of concern, but also maybe there's a little bit of hope there. There's a little bit of excitement for maybe what hasn't happened or what could happen, but also some fear over what might happen. And but also a little bit of grief over the things that have and have not happened in the last 12 months. So all of it is mixed in. And so the question becomes, like, how do you start a year with this much emotionally charged energy just existing all in the same place at the same time? And so it became sort of clear to us, like, oh, we need to address we have to just acknowledge the whole thing. That for those of us who are experiencing joy, and maybe there's a little bit of like heaviness in the middle of that joy, that has to be acknowledged. But for those of us who are experiencing heaviness, but also there's a little bit of lightness sprinkled in, we probably have to acknowledge that too. So this series is going to be an exploration that all of these things are part of the experience, and that this is a space where all of us, no matter where we started, what kind of mood, energy, whatever, however we entered into the space, it's all part of the conversation. And for some of us, like, it's happening all in the same space at the same time. So today we're gonna enter into the series, and we're gonna do that by looking at the entire book of Ecclesiastes. So if you didn't regret coming to church already, sorry, you are already regretting your woo. And by the way, it's not too late. If you want to be like, I forgot something in my car and just never come back, nobody's going to be mad at you. We get it. So, but for those of you who want to hang out with us for a little while, we are going to look at the entire book of Ecclesiastes, which I will warn you is a bummer. So we're just going to jump in to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1, and see where this takes us. So, Ecclesiastes, by the way, it is part of what we refer to as the Old Testament. It's in the Bible. It is part of a section of books called the wisdom books, which as we look at this, you might be like, I'm not, like, when you think wisdom books, you think like people are giving each other advice. Like, here's a good idea for how to handle this particular situation. Ecclesiastes has none of that. So the question becomes, like, how is this a wisdom book? Because there seems to be no wisdom left in here. All this seems to be is a guy making really sad observations. So we're just going to jump right in and see where this takes us. So in Ecclesiastes 1, beginning in verse 1, it says, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. By the way, Happy New Year, once again. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Generations come and generations go, but the earth remains forever. And then if you jump to verse 8, All things are wearisome, more than one can say. The eye never has enough of seeing, nor the ear its fill of hearing. What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which one can say, look, this is something new? It was here already, long ago. It was here before our time. No one remembers the former generations, and even those yet to come will not be remembered by those who follow them. This is how it starts. So this goes on, by the way, for a while. Like, if you're familiar with the book of Ecclesiastes, like, he's just getting warmed up. Like, this goes on for almost a whole, like, an entire second chapter after this. And he continues to, like, revisit this refrain, meaningless, meaningless. It's all meaningless. And so this is like early emo music for people who were into Hebrew poetry. So we have this going on in this book, and like, how do you even begin to interact with this? So here's the thing. This word meaningless in Hebrew doesn't mean what we think it means. It does not initially just mean a thing without any value, which is how in modern English that's what it is translated as. But literally, the Hebrew word here is the word vapor. It's not without value. What he's saying is it's temporary. So, in fact, I preached on this passage one time, a long time ago, and I thought I wanted to show, like have a visual representation of vapor. So I got like a little like cheap squirt bottle, and with water filled in it, and I tried to squirt it and show like vapor is like water that comes out of a squirt bottle, then immediately just goes away. And upon my first squirt, like the whole thing just like broke in my hand. And so now I've got like a broken squirt bottle and water all over me. So I didn't do that this time for fear of embarrassing myself a second time by looking at the same passage. But that would be the visual representation that I would give you if I was braver. So basically he's saying it's vapor. It is a thing that exists, and before you even know it, it no longer exists. So what he's acknowledging is not everything has no value. What he's acknowledging is everything is temporary. Everything is, it has a limited amount of lifespan. So there is a very real sense of impermanence to everything under the sun. The point he's trying to make, I would argue, is that things have value because they are temporary. Like the lack of permanence is the thing that gives this thing its meaning. And gives the thing its value. There's a comedian named Pete Holmes, and a thing I've heard Pete Holmes say is, he'll say, "Do you know why chocolate cake tastes so good? Well, it's because you know that you're going to die." And what he means by that is like, oh, right, like the thing that makes this thing good, the thing that makes this thing worth experiencing, is the reality that there is only so much of it that I will ever experience. If a thing is permanent, then it becomes less and less valuable because we just take it for granted that it will always be there. But if we enter into a situation with the acknowledgement of, oh, this thing that I actually do value, this thing will not be here with me forever, that is the thing that gives it its value. That is the thing that makes it significant to us. The fact that it is vapor is the thing that makes it worthwhile. So the writer is not interested, by the way, in making any kind. When you look at Ecclesiastes, the writer's not trying to make any sort of moral observations or judgment, which is why it's sort of confusing. Like, why is this a wisdom book? But the writer, because the writer's not trying to say this is good and this is bad. What the writer's doing is he's trying to give people he's not trying to give people a list of commandments to follow. He's making observations and saying, like, this is what it looks like to be a human being. This is what it looks like to be alive in the world. And so the first two chapters in Ecclesiastes, there's a lot of all of life is temporary. It's finite. It is vapor. So now let's jump over to Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And this is probably the most famous part of the book of Ecclesiastes. This was in the 60s, 70s era. This was popularized actually in a song by the Byrds. So they didn't come up with this on their own. They had some help. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, beginning in verse 1, this is what the writer says. It says, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace." Now, again, the writer is not making moral judgments. He's not falsely equating the value of these things. The writer is not saying love and hate are the same. He's not saying war and peace are the same. What he's saying is all of these things are part of what it means to be alive. All of these, like there is a spectrum to the kinds of experiences we will have while we are on this planet, and these are the furthest ends of the spectrum. There's a time for this, and there's a time for this. And yeah, it's going to seem like both these things are the exact opposite of each other. And the writer would say, yeah, that's the idea. Like the whole thing, all of life is filled with both sides of the spectrum. The whole thing is filled with things that are terrible and things that are beautiful. The whole thing is part of what it means to be alive. So his point here is life is not a static, non-moving thing. There are moments of unbelievable triumph, and there are other moments of devastating defeat. And we often find these things sitting right next door to each other, often in the same room at the same time. Now, a thing that a lot of us have experienced in our lives, depending on what traditions you've grown up with or what you've experienced in other like religious contexts, is there is a brand of Christian denialism that would argue that half of this poem is wrong. And what I mean by that is there is a brand of like Jesus-oriented faith tradition that would tell you that things like grief and sadness and mourning are wrong, because if you had more faith, you wouldn't be feeling those things. Are you with me? Like how many of us have experienced or known somebody who's been told in moments of struggle and in moments of pain, well, why don't you just pray more? Have you tried praying? You know what I mean? Like as if I can't imagine anything less helpful, by the way, than saying something like that to somebody. Because like, and somebody saying something like, if your faith was stronger, you wouldn't be going through this right now. And I think the writer of Ecclesiastes was saying, like, what planet are you living on? Because the one I'm living on, there's a time for this, and there's a time for joy, and a time for grief. So this denialism, this like, well, why don't you just believe harder? And why don't you just like have I used to know somebody who anytime somebody was going through a rough time, this is like a hardcore like self-righteous Christian type person, like every single time I ever saw somebody like going through a difficult time, inevitably if she got wind of it, she would be like, well, the joy of the Lord should be your strength. And I would be like, can you please be someplace else? Like this is not at all helpful, and you're actually annoying everyone. So but it's shallow, but it's also, quite frankly, it's dangerous, because people who talk to others who are suffering like this, like, God has a better plan, and if you had more faith, you would see that. What it does is it robs people of the ability to grieve, and it robs people of the ability to fully acknowledge their own actual circumstances in life. And so to say things like that to people, what it does is it's saying like what you're going through isn't true, or it isn't part of the human experience. And I think the writer of Ecclesiastes would say, my experience is telling me it really is. People use their faith often to create the illusion of a static reality. They will say things like, everything is fine, God is in control, nothing is wrong, just have faith and everything will stay the same. We've all heard like these little fortune cookie versions of theology that actually have no basis in what we find in the scriptures. So the writer of Ecclesiastes seems to insist that, yeah, there are times of joy and celebration, but there are also times of grieving and sorrow. And to deny that one or the other exists is to ignore half of what it means to be a human being living on this planet. And so he's not making judgments. He's not being prescriptive. He's just being descriptive. He's simply acknowledging this is what reality is. So this poem in chapter 3 is actually a microcosm, I would argue, of the entire book of Ecclesiastes, because it goes back and forth over and over and over again between there is this, but there is also this, and both are true. So like we said a few minutes ago, the first two chapters are mostly filled with meaningless, everything is temporary, everything is vapor. So time comes for us all is basically the message of the first bits of Ecclesiastes. It doesn't exactly leave you with like a spring in your step. So if you want to go back to chapter 2, verse 17, he continues this. And if you thought he couldn't get darker, hold on. He says, so I hated life because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind. If only there was a Christian around to tell this guy he should have more faith. You know what I mean? But then a few verses later in verse 24, it says, a person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? Okay, hold on. Did anybody else just get whiplash? Because for a while now, he's been talking about meaningless, nothing has any, like everything is temporary, time comes for us all, like what's the point of any of it? And then like at the very last minute before he ends the second chapter, he says, although there are some things that I actually do really like. So after almost 2 full chapters of talking about how everything is meaningless and how he literally says, I hated life. He says, but I did discover there are some things that do provide joy. There are some things in life that are worth savoring. There are some things that we can look at and experience and say, oh, this is actually a gift, and we can enjoy it. But later, but here's the thing. He doesn't stay in that place. He goes on to the turn part, and then later in chapter 3, in verse 19, he says, surely the fate of human beings is like that of the animals. The same fate awaits them both. As one dies, so dies the other. All have the same breath. Humans have no advantage over animals. Everything is meaningless. Okay, so like whatever like joy he was feeling a minute ago, it's gone. So then in chapter 4, verse 1, he says, again, I looked and saw all of the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. Power was on the side of the oppressors, and they have no comforter. So now he's like expanding his perspective, as if somebody said like, well, maybe you're just like a little in your own head. But what if you look around at the rest of the world? Have you considered like all of the things going on? And he's like, yeah, I see a lot of suffering and oppression. What of it? So now he's observing like the misery of other people. Then in verse 7, he says, again, I saw something meaningless under the sun. There was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother. There was no end to his toil, yet his eyes were not content with his wealth. For whom am I toiling, he asked, and why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business. So he seems to be making an interesting observation, though, is he not? Because he's saying, no matter how much somebody works, it's never going to be enough. And however many possessions we acquire, there will always be more that we don't have. And there will always be a sense of emptiness. Like if all we're trying to do is like build up and acquire more and more, there will always be something that we don't have that gives us some sense of grief or loss. But then in verse 10, or I'm sorry, if you jump down to chapter 5, verse 10, he says, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. But then just a few verses later, like 8 verses later in verse 5, or in chapter 5, he says this in verse 18. He says, this is what I have observed to be good, that it is appropriate for a person to eat, to drink, and to find satisfaction in their toilsome labor under the sun during the few days of life God has given them, for this is our lot. Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift of God. They seldom reflect on the days of their life because God keeps them occupied with gladness in their heart. So there's this weird, interesting kind of thing, like this weird headspace he seems to be occupying of, it is possible to work really hard and to gain lots and lots of things and to still hate your own life and to be miserable. It is also possible to do all of those same things, but to have the perspective of gratitude, and that tends to sort of change how we interact. Like you can interact with this as if it is a thing that we're just like dumping ourselves into like every day until we die, or it is like, oh, I actually have the ability to work, and I have the ability to build some sort of like legacy to leave behind, and there's something beautiful about like I can enjoy the things that I have like earned or gained at some sort of level. He's acknowledging like, yeah, both are possible. So it is possible for one person to experience both of those emotions, and so he has this perception of people who have lots and lots of money, which apparently includes himself, and he says, sometimes people who are in this position always want more. We always wish we had more. But then he says, there are also people, and maybe it's the same people a lot of times, who love what they do and are able to find joy in how they spend their time. And he says, this is a gift from God. So he stays at this frequency for a little while. But then in chapter 6, he drops back down in verse 3. He says, a man may have 100 children and live many years, yet no matter how long he lives, if he cannot enjoy his prosperity and does not receive a proper burial, I say that a stillborn child is better off than he. So I'd say we're back to low. So let's jump way over to chapter 8. So in chapter 8, beginning in verse 1, he says, who is like the wise person? Who knows the explanation of things? A person's wisdom brightens their face and changes its hard appearance. So he goes not that long. He doesn't take that long to go from like, we'd all be better off dead to like, hey, wisdom brightens the face. Like, so we're back up. And then in verse 14, just a few verses later, he says, there is something else meaningless that occurs on the earth. And you would think, like, haven't you gotten tired of listing all the things that are meaningless? And he's like, no, I have more. So he says, there is something else meaningless that occurs on earth. The righteous who get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked who get what the righteous deserve. This, too, I say, is meaningless. So he's acknowledging that often good things happen to people who do bad things, and bad things will happen to people who try their best to do good things. So he's acknowledging, like, there is a massive imbalance in the scales of justice in the world. But then literally in the very next sentence, like, I don't even have to jump. We can just keep reading. So in verse 15, he says, so I commend the enjoyment of life, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of their life that God has given them under the sun. I don't even know what to make of this. Like, there is no justice. Good people suffer for no reason. Bad people get away with stuff every day, so let's all be glad and enjoy life. Like, dude, where are you? Like, how hard are you thinking about all of this stuff that you're writing, like, these two different sentences seem to be written by two different people. It's like there's two different people who keep grabbing the pen out of each other's hands and be like, no, I have something to say now. Like, it's like the writer doesn't even agree with himself a lot of the time. Then if you jump down to chapter 9, because this goes on for 9 chapters. In verse 3, he says, this is the evil in everything that happens under the sun. The same destiny overtakes all. The hearts of people, moreover, are full of evil, and there is madness in their hearts while they live, and afterward they join the dead. So again, back to low. Then a few verses later in verse 7, he says, go, eat your food with gladness, drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God, or if you're Baptist, go enjoy your grape juice with grateful heart. For God has already approved what you do. So just like that, we're back up. So he is all over the place. It is like this whole book has this very unusual kind of jarring, I want to use the word flow, but that doesn't even sound right. It's this jarring, like back and forth movement of the tone of the entire book. To say that the tone is uneven would be an understatement. It really feels like we need to, like, find this guy and, like, pat him on the shoulder and be like, hey man, are you okay? Because you seem all over the place. Like, it seems like you don't even know how you feel from sentence to sentence. So the question we're left with is, what is the point of this book? What are we? Because that's the book. Like, there's not one instruction, no command, no, like, here's a list of 10 things to do so that you can be a more faithful, self-righteous person. There's none of that. This is all of it. It's all just observations. It's meaningless, but also there's joy. What do you do? So the notion that everything can and should be good all the time, as long as we have enough faith, I would argue what this writer is saying is, like, that is a fantasy. That is not reality. Like, whoever told you that had never even heard of the book of Ecclesiastes. So sometimes we do feel overburdened by pain and despair. And sometimes we feel filled with hope and with joy. And sometimes those two things are in direct proximity to each other. Sometimes they're in the same room at the same time. This is what it means to be human and alive in the world. So we live in this reality where it is possible to experience joy or pain at any given moment. There will be days when it feels like things are going exactly the way that they were meant to. There will be days when you feel energized and you feel alive. There will also be days when you want to crawl back under the covers and never come out again. Both things are true. We live inside this tension. Both realities are true at the same time. So again, sometimes in the same room at the same moment. If we jump way back to the very earliest chapters of the scriptures, we can look at the book of Genesis. Now, the first 2 chapters in the book of Genesis are this interesting sort of exploration of the creation of all things. And what's going on in Genesis 1 and 2 is you have a God that continues to create, and as things are being created, God continues to say, the thing that I just created is good. This is an over and over and over refrain. This thing has been created, and the thing that was created is good. Now, the word that gets used to describe the state of this goodness often is the word shalom. And shalom is not just a lack of conflict. Shalom is things are the way they were meant to be. Everything in its right place. The gospel according to Radiohead. So we have this thing where everything is in its right place. Everything is the way that it was meant to. But then in chapter 3, there is a disruption to shalom. Things are no longer the way they were meant to. And as a result of this disruption, things begin to change. And there is this descriptive moment when God begins to speak to humanity and begins to say, like, now that shalom has been disrupted, here's what reality will look like. And this begins a few verses of, it's like things are going to be harder and things are going to feel more broken than they did before. And one of the things that shows up in verse 16 in chapter 3, it says, to the woman, God said, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor, you will give birth to children. Now, it's easy to read this and assume that all it means is having babies is going to hurt, to which every mother in the room was like, we know. But that is not the point of what is being said. The point here is not like it didn't hurt before and now it's going to hurt. The point that's being made here is there will be moments that should be filled with unbelievable amounts of joy and hope and celebration. There will be moments that feel like a new beginning. But in those moments, there will also be present pain and struggle. So what this passage is doing, it's not just acknowledging like physical pain in childbirth. The passage is acknowledging that even our best moments may sometimes also bear some amount of sadness or grief or pain. That even the moments that are filled with joy will also have a slight twinge of loss or grief. If you have older kids and you've ever looked at pictures of them when they were younger, you know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? I remember several years ago, Caroline, my wife, and I we were leaving a wedding, and we'd been at this wedding. It was for some friends who had been together for a long time, and there was this. And they'd gotten engaged, and they had been sort of planning this wedding for a really long time, and everyone who knew them was super excited to be at this wedding. And we went, and I remember it was an I don't want to say an unusually fun wedding. Weddings should be fun, should they not? But like it was one of those weddings that was like this is a good time. Like I'm happy to hang out with everybody who's here. This is it is a fun, joyful way to spend a Saturday evening. And so we leave. We once the wedding was coming to an end, we were walking to our car, and it's November. And we're walking to our car, and by the time we got to our car, it didn't take long to realize that the back, the driver's side back glass of our car had been shattered, and Caroline's purse had been stolen out of the back seat. So somebody, while we were in this wedding, where we're celebrating, we're enjoying the company of friends, while that was happening, someone was breaking into our car and stealing Caroline's purse. So we're standing there in the middle of November in the freezing cold, filing a police report, when only a few minutes earlier, we were in a wedding and having a joyful, celebratory experience. Like, it happens so fast. Like, how is it, like, we hadn't even left the parking lot, and already the entire mood of the day had changed completely. So it happens so fast. Like, you can be in a moment of joy and celebration and experience like just like a punch in the face of loss and pain and like a feeling of violation. If you've ever had your car broken into, you know, like that is a particularly like weird emotional event. But it's also possible to be going through something difficult and for someone to enter in and offer some amount of joy and lightness. Both are possible. Both are true. It is possible to experience something joyful, but also to feel some sense of loss. It's possible to feel some sense of loss and feel also a twinge of hope or joy. Both can be present in the same place at the same time. Have you ever lost a loved one, and then you had to celebrate a holiday or a birthday for the first time after they were gone? How many of us, we just came out of Christmas, New Year's, Thanksgiving. How many of us in the last 6 weeks had a moment where we were celebrating with a group of people, and then somebody looked over and there was a chair that was empty, and we knew exactly who should have been sitting in that chair? You know what I mean? Yeah. How many of us have ever had a big event happen in our lives, something that should be something we could celebrate and be excited about, and you know exactly who you want to tell and who you wish could celebrate with you, and then you realize they're not there for me to call. That person is not available for me to reach out to and to share this moment with. So you have a moment of joy that is immediately followed by a moment of grief. Conversely, have you ever been at a funeral or in a hospital waiting room, and everyone is filled with this dread and grief and fear, and then someone says something, and then everybody starts laughing? Why? Because joy and sorrow are often right next to each other in the same space at the same time. Joy and sorrow often can and often do exist in the same space at the same time. The writer of Ecclesiastes would say, well, yeah, of course. That's how it's always been. That's what it means to be human. That's what it means to be alive in this world. And to deny either of those realities is to deny part of what it means to be human. So what are we supposed to do with the book of Ecclesiastes? What is even the point of the book of Ecclesiastes? I would argue the reason we need Ecclesiastes is because it provides us with evidence that the Bible, as a complete, full work, acknowledges the entire spectrum of the human experience. Ecclesiastes is giving us permission to fully confront all of the experiences that make up our lives, both the terrible experiences and the beautiful experiences. I had a seminary professor who would talk about Ecclesiastes because it's part of the wisdom books. And again, we think about wisdom books like Proverbs, and Proverbs is a book that exists, like it's basically like a bunch of advice. Like, here's what I have observed that this is better than this. And it's easy to quote, and it's easy to like put in like a graduation card, which, by the way, if somebody ever asked you to like fill out a graduation card for somebody, like, hey, maybe put your favorite Bible verse, I challenge you to put anything from Ecclesiastes chapter 1 in there. Like, meaningless. It's all meaningless. We all die someday. Happy graduation. So it's all there. It's all in there. But then what do you do with it? Because again, like most people put like something from Proverbs, like save your money or whatever. And that's a direct quote from Proverbs, save your money or whatever. But then you have Ecclesiastes. Like, how is this part of the wisdom tradition? I had a seminary professor who would say, oh, this is part of the wisdom tradition because Ecclesiastes is what you need when none of the wisdom from Proverbs is working anymore. Because there are moments when, like, yeah, the practical stuff is very helpful, but there are also moments when all we can do is sort of acknowledge the broad range of experiences and say, like, yeah, I guess the whole thing is part of it. So Ecclesiastes is wisdom. It's the wisdom we find after the wisdom that stopped working for us. So the title of the series, What a Terrible World, What a Beautiful World, actually comes from a song by one of my favorite bands, the Decemberists. And the title of the song is actually not the same as the title of the series. The title of the song that it comes from the title is 12/17/12, which is a date. It's December the 12th, or December the 17th, 2012, which if you don't remember this exact date, that's fine. But the day before that, December the 17th, 2012, was the day of the Sandy Hook shooting. And so the songwriter, Colin Molloy, was the day after that grieving, as most of us were, because this was a horrific, like one of the most horrific events in living memory. And he's grieving this moment and sort of like lamenting the fact that we could even be in this place at all. But also he's reckoning with his wife is pregnant and they're about to have a new baby. And so in the song he refers to, he says, this cannonball in the bosom of your belly. And so he talks about, in the song, he talks about, yeah, there's this, like, I'm horrified and I'm sickened and I'm grieved by this thing that all of us are watching on the news, but also I feel almost guilty over the fact that I'm so excited to meet my kid. And both are happening at the same time. What a terrible world, but also what a beautiful world. Ecclesiastes is an invitation to honestly and soberly acknowledge all of the experiences that make up our lives. There will be moments of grief and loss and fear and sadness, and you can name those moments. You can claim them for what they are. You don't have to downplay them or pretend or deny your reality, but there will also be moments of joy and hope and lightness, and we can embrace those moments and try and be fully present for those. Take a mental snapshot of those moments because they're a gift. Both are part of it. Now, if we jump way ahead and look at the book of Philippians, there's this letter by a guy named Paul who's writing to a church in a city called Philippi. And what's interesting about Philippians is he's writing from a Roman prison cell, which in terms of like the quality of prison cells is one of the worst ones, I would say. So in Philippians 4, Paul is writing from a Roman prison cell. And in verse 6, Paul says this to this group of people. He says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace, and he does not say, and whatever you ask for, that's what's going to happen. He says, and the peace of God will transcend all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. He's writing this from prison, and he knows the outlook is not good. And he's saying, it is possible in those moments of fear and dread and loss, it is possible to still carry with you some kind of peace. So maybe the thing we need most is peace, because the good is going to happen and the bad is going to happen, and the best thing we can hope for is maybe in the midst of all those things, we can hope for some percentage of peace to also be carried with us. The through line that runs through both the beautiful moments and the terrible moments is a longing for peace. So for those of us who are in a place of joy, for those of us who have reason to be happy and excited and to celebrate, may you fully live in those moments. May you embrace those moments. May you be grateful. May you, again, take as many mental pictures as you can. Try and spend as much time you can being fully present and engaged in those moments because they're a gift. And for those of us in a place of sorrow, for those of us who are entering into 2025 with a list of names that aren't coming with us, for those of us who have lost something, for those of us who feel some sense of dread or despair, for those of us who are struggling with some kind of illness or some kind of heavy burden that we have to carry, may we acknowledge those as well. May we not fall into this pattern of denying what's true about our circumstances. And for those of us everywhere in between, for those of us who are experiencing both things at the same time, may we be honest with ourselves about those things. May we find peace in those moments. And may we acknowledge that to be human is to live in a world that is both terrible and beautiful, and it's all part of the story.